Maren Whitcomb froze with her hand on the bathroom door, because the voice on the other side of the wall belonged to her husband. She had only stepped away from the party for 2 minutes, just to fix her earrings and check her phone, and now she stood in a narrow hallway lit by a single gold lamp, listening to Daniel Ashworth laugh, in a way she had not heard him laugh in years. He was talking to Colin, his old friend from university, the one who always drank too much and said too much. Their voices carried easily through the thin wall that separated the hallway from the small side patio where the smokers gathered. "Come on," Colin was saying. "You can't tell me you don't still think about Claire sometimes." Maren's fingers tightened around the strap of her small clutch bag. Claire. The name landed in her chest like a dropped stone. Daniel had mentioned Claire before, always briefly, always with a wave of his hand, and a line like, "That's ancient history," or, "We were kids." She had never pressed him on it. She had never felt the need to. She heard Daniel exhale, the sound of a man choosing his words carefully, and then he said something that made the floor tilt beneath her feet. "Honestly? Yeah, sometimes. But Maren was there when I needed someone to be there. She was the one who happened to show up at the right time." Colin laughed again, a low, teasing laugh, the kind old friends use when they think no one else is listening. So she was the rebound that stuck. There was a pause. A pause that lasted only a second or two in real time, but that stretched out in Maren's mind, like a long hallway with no end. And then Daniel said, quietly, almost fondly, as if he were confessing something sweet rather than something devastating. "I mean, if you want to put it that way. She wasn't my first choice, but she turned out to be a good one." Maren did not move. She did not gasp. She did not drop her clutch bag. She did not do any of the things people do in films when they overhear something that breaks them in half. She simply stood there, in a hallway that smelled faintly of candle wax and spilled wine, and let the words settle into her like stones sinking through still water. A good one. Not the one. A good one. The way you might describe a decent restaurant, or a reliable car, or a coat that fits well enough even if it wasn't the one you originally wanted. She thought about walking around the corner. She thought about stepping onto that patio and asking Daniel to repeat what he had just said, this time to her face. She imagined the shock that would cross his features, the scramble to explain, the inevitable, "You're taking this the wrong way." She had seen him do that before, turn her hurt into her overreaction, turn his carelessness into her sensitivity. She did not want to give him the chance to do it again, not tonight. Not while the sound of his laughter with Colin was still fresh in her ears. Instead, she turned and walked back toward the party, back into the warm golden light and the clink of glasses, and the low hum of 40 people pretending to enjoy an engagement celebration for a coworker she barely knew. She found her friend Priya near the drinks table, deep in conversation with someone from the marketing department, and she slipped in beside her, smiling the practiced smile of a woman who has spent 4 years learning how to smile through discomfort. "There you are," Priya said, looping an arm through hers. "I thought you'd fallen in." "Just fixing my face," Maren said, and her voice came out steady, which surprised her. She had expected it to shake. For the next hour, Maren moved through the party like a woman, walking through water, aware of every step, aware of the effort each smile required. She watched Daniel from across the room as he drifted back inside, his tie slightly loosened, his cheeks flushed with 2 glasses of wine, entirely unaware that the conversation he'd just had with Colin was now lodged permanently in his wife's memory. He caught her eye once, and raised his glass toward her, a small private gesture they had shared since their wedding day. She raised hers back. She did not know what else to do. They had married 4 years ago, in a garden ceremony under string lights, with her mother crying in the front row, and his mother dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she kept tucked into her sleeve. Maren remembered standing across from him, remembered the way his hands had trembled slightly as he slid the ring onto her finger, remembered thinking that she had never felt so certain of anything in her life. She had believed, wholly and without question, that Daniel had chosen her, not settled for her, chosen her. Now she wondered how much of that certainty had been real, and how much of it had simply been her own hope, dressed up to look like truth. On the drive home, Daniel talked. He always talked more after a few drinks, filling silences with stories about people from work, complaints about his boss, plans for the weekend. Marin nodded in the right places and made the small sounds people make when they are listening but not really listening, her eyes fixed on the streetlights sliding past the window, each one another small pulse of light before the darkness returned. "You're quiet," Daniel said eventually, glancing at her as he waited at a red light. "Everything okay?" "Just tired," Marin said. "Long week." He reached over and squeezed her knee, the same casual, affectionate gesture he had made 1,000 times before, and for the first time in their marriage, she felt herself flinch slightly at his touch. He didn't notice. He was already turning the radio dial, searching for a station he liked, humming along to a song she didn't recognize. At home, she went through the motions of the evening, the way she always did. She hung up her coat. She took off her earrings and placed them in the small dish on her dresser. She washed her face, and brushed her teeth, and put on the soft gray pajamas she kept folded under her pillow. She did all of this, while a single sentence looped endlessly in her mind. "She wasn't my first choice, but she turned out to be a good one." Daniel fell asleep quickly, as he always did, his breathing slowing into the familiar rhythm she had grown used to hearing beside her every night for 4 years. Marin lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, feeling something inside her shift and settle into a new and unfamiliar shape. She thought about the early days of their relationship, the way he used to text her good morning before she'd even opened her eyes, the way he had shown up outside her apartment with soup when she had the flu, the way he had cried, actually cried, when he asked her to marry him. She had always taken these things as proof of his love. Now she wondered if they had simply been proof of his need, a need to fill a space that someone else had left empty. She thought about the timeline. Daniel had told her, early on, that he and Claire had broken up nearly a year before he and Marin started dating. She had never had reason to question this, but now, lying in the dark, she found herself trying to recall exact dates, small comments he had made over the years, things that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt like pieces of a puzzle she had never realized she was assembling. There had been a comment from his sister, once, at a family dinner 2 years into their marriage, something like, "It's funny, you and Claire broke up right around when you and Marin met, wasn't it?" Daniel had laughed it off, said his sister always got her timelines confused, and Marin had let it go, because why would she doubt him? Why would anyone doubt the person they loved, the person who had promised to spend his life with them? But now that comment sat differently in her memory. Now it felt less like an innocent mix-up, and more like a small crack in a wall she had never bothered to examine closely. Marin did not sleep that night, not really. She drifted in and out of a shallow, restless half-sleep, waking every hour or so to find herself staring at the same patch of ceiling, the same thoughts circling endlessly through her mind. By the time the first gray light of morning began to creep through the curtains, she had made a decision, though she did not yet know exactly what that decision would require of her. She was not going to pretend she hadn't heard what she'd heard. But she also was not going to walk into the kitchen that morning and demand an explanation, not yet. She needed to understand first. She needed to know whether what she had overheard was a careless joke, fueled by wine and an old friend's teasing, or whether it was something closer to the truth, a truth Daniel had never intended for her to hear. She got out of bed before her alarm, careful not to wake him, and went downstairs to make coffee. The kitchen was quiet and gray in the early light, the counters bare except for a fruit bowl and a stack of unopened mail. She stood at the window, while the coffee maker hissed and gurgled, looking out at their small backyard, at the wooden fence Daniel had built the summer after they bought the house, at the garden she had planted and mostly failed to maintain. This was supposed to be her life. This kitchen, this yard, this man sleeping upstairs. She had built an entire identity around the certainty that she was loved, wanted, chosen. And now, standing in the quiet kitchen with the smell of coffee filling the air, she felt that certainty crack open, revealing something colder and more uncertain underneath. She heard Daniel's footsteps on the stairs a little while later, heavier than usual, the sound of a man nursing a mild headache after too much wine the night before. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in his old gray t-shirt and pajama pants, his hair disheveled, and gave her a sleepy, easy smile. "Morning," he said, moving toward the coffee pot. "Did you sleep okay? You seemed off in the car last night." "I'm fine," Marin said, and she was surprised again by how steady her voice sounded. "Just didn't sleep well." Daniel poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, studying her for a moment in that way he sometimes did, as if trying to read something in her expression that she wasn't saying out loud. For a brief second, Marin wondered if he somehow knew, if some instinct had told him that his careless words on the patio had found their way to her ears. But then he simply shrugged, took a sip of his coffee, and asked what she wanted to do for breakfast, and the moment passed. Marin smiled and said something about eggs, and the day continued in its ordinary rhythm, breakfast, and small talk, and the quiet hum of a Sunday morning. But underneath that ordinary rhythm, something new had taken root in her, something quiet and resolute, and though she did not yet know what shape it would take, she understood, with a clarity she had not expected, that nothing about her life was going to look the same again. By the time she left for work on Monday morning, kissing Daniel goodbye at the door the way she always did, she had already begun, in the privacy of her own mind, to ask the questions she had never let herself ask before. She did not know yet where those questions would lead her, but she knew she could no longer pretend she hadn't heard what she'd heard, and she knew, somewhere deep in the quiet, steady center of herself, that she deserved to know the truth. Marin spent the next several days moving through her ordinary routine, while carrying an extraordinary weight beneath the surface. She went to work, sat through meetings, answered emails, laughed at her coworkers' jokes during lunch breaks, and came home each evening to the same house, the same husband, the same life, that now felt like a stage set rather than something real. Nobody around her seemed to notice the change, which surprised her, because inside she felt entirely different, as though a second version of herself had quietly taken up residence beneath her skin. She worked as a project coordinator for a small architecture firm downtown, a job she had held for 6 years and generally enjoyed. Her desk sat near a window that overlooked a busy street, and she often found herself staring out at the people passing below, wondering how many of them were carrying secrets of their own, quiet burdens hidden behind ordinary faces. On Wednesday, during her lunch break, she called Priya, who had been her closest friend since college. They usually spoke every few days, but Marin had been quieter than usual since the party, and Priya, sharp as always, had noticed. "Okay, something's wrong," Priya said, skipping past any greeting. "You've been weird since Saturday. Talk to me." Marin sat on a bench in the small park near her office, the phone pressed to her ear, watching a woman toss bread to a group of pigeons nearby. She hesitated, unsure how to begin, unsure whether saying the words out loud would make them more real than they already felt. "I overheard something at the party," she finally said. "Daniel, talking to Colin. About Claire." Priya was quiet for a moment. "What kind of something?" Marin repeated the conversation as best she could remember it, her voice steady even as her chest tightened with each word. She told Priya about the pause after Colin's comment, about Daniel's laugh, about the sentence that had lodged itself in her mind and refused to leave. "She wasn't my first choice, but she turned out to be a good one." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Marin," Priya said finally, "I'm so sorry." "I don't even know what to do with it," Marin admitted. "Part of me wants to believe it was just stupid talk, the kind of thing men say when they've had too much wine, and they're trying to sound clever in front of an old friend. But another part of me keeps thinking about all the little things over the years that never quite added up." "Like what?" Marin told her about the timeline, about Daniel's sister's comment at the family dinner 2 years earlier, about the way Daniel always changed the subject slightly too quickly whenever Claire's name came up, a habit she had noticed but never questioned. Small things. Individually, none of them meant much. But strung together, they formed a pattern she could no longer ignore. "Do you want me to help you look into it?" Priya asked. "I mean, if you want to know the actual timeline, we could probably figure it out. Social media, old photos, that kind of thing." Marin considered this. Part of her recoiled at the idea, at the thought of digging through old photographs and posts like some kind of investigator building a case against her own husband. But another part of her, the part that had lain awake staring at the ceiling for 3 nights in a row, needed to know. "Yes," she said finally, "I want to know." That evening, after Daniel had fallen asleep in front of the television, worn out from a long day at work, Marin sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and began, quietly and methodically, to search. She started with old photographs on social media, comparing dates, trying to remember when exactly she and Daniel had first met. It had been at a mutual friend's birthday dinner, nearly 5 years ago now, in early autumn. She remembered the dress she had worn, remembered the way Daniel had made her laugh within the first 10 minutes of conversation, remembered thinking, even then, that there was something easy and comfortable about him. She searched for photographs from that same period featuring Claire, whose full name she had heard only a handful of times over the years, but had never bothered to look up. It did not take long to find her. Claire Bennett, according to an old tagged photo from a mutual acquaintance, had attended a wedding with Daniel that same autumn, only weeks before the dinner where Maren had met him. In the photograph, Claire's arm was looped through Daniel's, and they were both smiling in a way that looked, to Maren's careful eye, distinctly like two people still together. Maren stared at the photograph for a long time, her chest tight, her hands cold despite the warmth of the kitchen. If this photograph was accurate, then Daniel had not been broken up with Claire for nearly a year before he met Maren, as he had always claimed. He had been broken up with her for, at most, a few weeks, possibly less. She sat back in her chair, the laptop's glow the only light in the darkened kitchen, and allowed herself to feel, fully and without restraint, for the first time since the party, the full weight of what this meant. Daniel had lied to her, not once but many times, in small quiet ways, for years, and she had believed him, because she had loved him, and because it had never occurred to her that the man who cried at their wedding might have been mourning someone else's absence, even as he promised her his future. She closed the laptop and sat in the darkness for a long time, listening to the faint sound of the television still playing in the next room, the low murmur of Daniel's breathing as he dozed on the couch. She thought about waking him, about marching into the living room and demanding an explanation right then and there, but something in her held back, some instinct that told her she was not yet ready, that she needed more than a photograph and a fragment of an overheard conversation before she confronted him. She wanted the whole truth, not the version he would construct in the heat of the moment, scrambling to soften the blow, but the real, unvarnished truth, gathered piece by piece, until there was no room left for him to explain it away. Over the following days, Maren continued her quiet investigation, careful not to let Daniel notice any change in her behavior. She spoke with a mutual friend, a woman named Grace, who had known both Daniel and Claire before Maren had ever entered the picture. Grace, unaware of the significance of her words, mentioned casually over coffee that she remembered Daniel being a wreck when he and Claire finally ended things, and that it had all happened pretty suddenly, right around the time he met you actually. Maren smiled and nodded and asked no further questions, though inside, each new confirmation landed like another small stone added to the weight already sitting in her chest. By the end of the week, she had assembled enough pieces to form a clear picture, one that no longer left much room for doubt. Daniel had still been involved with Claire, in some capacity, when he met Maren. Whether it had technically ended before their first date or shortly after, the emotional overlap was undeniable. He had built their relationship on top of an ending he had never fully closed, and he had spent years since then allowing Maren to believe she had been his clear, uncomplicated choice, when the truth was far messier and far less flattering. She did not feel angry yet, not in the sharp, immediate way she had expected. Instead, she felt a strange, quiet grief, as though she were mourning a version of her marriage that had never actually existed, a version she had believed in for 4 years, without ever questioning its foundation. On Friday evening, as she and Daniel sat together at the dinner table, he reached across and took her hand, smiling at her in the easy, familiar way he always did. "You've seemed a little distant this week," he said. "Everything all right?" Maren looked at him, at the face she had loved for so long, at the hand holding hers with such casual confidence, and felt something inside her settle into place, quiet and certain. "I'm fine," she said, "just thinking about some things." She was not ready to tell him what she knew. Not yet. But she understood now, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its certainty, that the life she had believed in was no longer the life she was actually living, and she was going to need time and courage to decide exactly what she planned to do about it. 2 weeks passed before Maren decided she was ready to speak with Daniel directly, and in that time, she became a quieter, more watchful version of herself, observing her own marriage the way a stranger might observe it, noticing details she had once taken for granted. She noticed how often Daniel checked his phone during dinner. She noticed how he sometimes grew distracted mid-conversation, his eyes drifting towards some middle distance she could not follow. She noticed, too, how comfortable their life together had become, how easily they moved around each other in the kitchen, how well she could predict what he would say before he said it. She had once considered this comfort a sign of a strong marriage. Now she wondered if it was simply the comfort of routine, the kind that could exist even without real love underneath it. She spoke again with grace, this time more directly, no longer disguising her questions as idle curiosity. Grace, sensing something serious in Marin's tone, finally admitted the fuller truth she had been dancing around during their earlier coffee. Daniel and Claire had not simply ended things suddenly around the time he met Marin. According to Grace, there had been a difficult period of several weeks where Daniel had been, in Grace's words, seeing both of you around the same time, though I don't think Claire knew that for a while. Marin sat with this information for a long moment before responding. Did you know? At the time? Grace hesitated. I suspected. I didn't think it was my place to say anything. And honestly, Marin, I figured whatever happened between him and Claire was over and done with, and you two seemed happy. I didn't think it mattered anymore. Marin understood the logic, even as it stung. People rarely intervened in situations that appeared, from the outside, to have worked out fine. But sitting across from Grace, in a small cafe, on a gray Tuesday afternoon, Marin felt the full shape of what had actually happened settle over her, heavier and more complicated than she had expected. Daniel had not simply moved on quickly after a clean break. He had overlapped two relationships, allowed Claire to remain unaware for weeks while he began building something new with Marin, and then constructed, over the following years, a version of their history that conveniently erased all of that messiness. She thanked Grace for her honesty, and walked home slowly that evening, taking a longer route than usual, past the small park where she and Daniel used to walk during the early months of their relationship. She remembered how he used to hold her hand tightly, as though afraid she might disappear, how he used to tell her that meeting her had felt like being handed a second chance he didn't think he deserved. At the time, she had found this romantic, evidence of how deeply he valued her. Now she understood it differently. He had not been describing devotion. He had been describing relief, the relief of a man who had escaped the wreckage of one relationship and landed, gratefully but perhaps not entirely by choice, in the arms of another. That night, she made her decision. She would confront him, not with anger, not with accusations she could not fully prove, but with the truth, as she had gathered it, calmly and clearly, and she would watch closely how he responded. She believed, with a kind of quiet certainty, that his response would tell her everything she needed to know about whether their marriage had any real foundation left to stand on. She chose a Saturday morning for the conversation, when they would have the whole day ahead of them, when there would be no work schedule to interrupt whatever followed. Daniel was in the kitchen making coffee, still in his pajamas, humming quietly to himself, when Marin walked in and sat down at the table. "Can we talk?" she asked. Something in her tone must have alerted him, because he turned from the counter immediately, his easy morning expression shifting into something more careful. "Of course," he said, moving to sit across from her. "What's going on?" Marin folded her hands on the table in front of her, steadying herself. "At the engagement party a few weeks ago," she began, "I overheard you talking to Colin, on the patio." She watched his face carefully as she spoke, watched the flicker of confusion give way, slowly, to recognition, and then to something that looked uncomfortably close to guilt. "I heard what you said about Claire," Marin continued, "about how I wasn't your first choice, about how I just happened to show up at the right time." Daniel's face went pale. "Marin, that was just talk. Colin was being an idiot, and I was just going along with it. I didn't mean." "I also know," Marin said, her voice steady despite the tremor she could feel building in her chest, "that you and Claire were still together, in some way, when you and I started seeing each other. I know it wasn't the clean break you always told me it was." For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. He stared at the table, his jaw tightening, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug, as though it were the only stable thing left in the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had expected. "It wasn't like that. I mean, it was complicated, but it wasn't like I was choosing between you two the whole time we've been together. That was just at the very beginning, before we were really serious." "But you let me believe something that wasn't true," Marin said, "for years, and you said, out loud, to your friend, that I wasn't your first choice." "I was drunk," Daniel said, his voice rising slightly, defensive now. I was just talking. It didn't mean anything. You're taking one comment and turning it into this whole thing. I'm not turning anything into anything, Maren said, cutting him off, her voice calm but firm, in a way that seemed to surprise him. I'm asking you to be honest with me. Right now. No more careful wording, no more convenient timelines. Was I your first choice, or wasn't I? Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. The silence stretched between them, longer and heavier than any silence they had shared in 4 years of marriage, and in that silence, Maren felt something inside her go very still and very clear. I don't know how to answer that, Daniel finally said, quietly, almost helplessly. I love you, Maren, I do. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend that things with Claire didn't affect how everything started between us. It was not a confession exactly, but it was close enough. Close enough that Maren felt the last small flicker of doubt inside her extinguish completely. She had come into this conversation hoping, in some small, quiet corner of her heart, that he would deny it entirely, that he would look her in the eye and tell her the party conversation was nothing but careless nonsense, that the timeline she had pieced together was somehow wrong. Instead, he had confirmed, in his own halting, uncomfortable way, that the story she had believed in for 4 years had never been entirely true. Okay, Maren said, and she was surprised by how calm her voice sounded, even to her own ears. Thank you for telling me that. Daniel looked up at her, confused by her composure. So, are we okay? Can we move past this? Maren looked at him for a long moment, this man she had loved so completely, this man whose face she knew better than her own, and felt, for the first time in years, a genuine uncertainty about what came next. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I need some time to think. She stood from the table and walked upstairs, leaving him sitting alone in the kitchen with his cooling coffee and his half-formed explanations. And though she did not yet know exactly what her next steps would be, she understood, with a clarity that felt almost like relief, that she was no longer willing to live inside a story that had never been entirely true. The days following the conversation in the kitchen settled into an uneasy quiet. Daniel tried, in his own clumsy way, to make things right. He came home from work with flowers twice that week, a gesture that had once made Maren's heart lift, and now only made her feel strangely hollow, as though he were trying to paper over a crack in the foundation, with something as flimsy as a bouquet of tulips. He suggested dinner at the restaurant where they'd had their first date. He left small notes on the bathroom mirror, the kind he used to leave in the early years of their relationship, simple words like, I love you, written in dry erase marker. Maren accepted all of these gestures with polite gratitude, but something in her had shifted permanently, and she found she could not force herself back into the easy affection she once felt so naturally. She began sleeping in the guest room, telling Daniel she needed space to think clearly, and though he protested at first, he eventually stopped arguing, perhaps sensing that pushing too hard would only push her further away. During this time, Maren found herself drawn back to Priya's apartment most evenings after work, sitting on her friend's small balcony with a cup of tea, talking through everything that had happened, trying to make sense of a marriage that suddenly felt like a foreign country she had lived in for years, without ever fully understanding the language. He says he loves you, Priya pointed out one evening, not unkindly, simply laying out the facts as she saw them. That has to count for something, right? Maren considered this for a long time before answering. I believe he loves me, she said finally. I don't doubt that anymore, but I keep thinking about something my grandmother used to say. She used to say that being loved isn't the same as being chosen. You can love someone and still not choose them. Not really. Not with your whole heart. And I think that's what happened with Daniel and me. He loved me. But somewhere along the way, in the beginning, he didn't fully choose me. He just ended up with me, because I was there, and because I was easy, and because Claire wasn't available anymore. Priya was quiet for a moment, turning her teacup slowly in her hands. Do you think that's still true now? After 4 years? I don't know, Maren admitted. That's the part I can't figure out. Maybe somewhere along the way, he really did choose me. Maybe love grew into something real, even if it didn't start out that way. But I keep coming back to that word he used. Good. He said I turned out to be a good one. Not the one. Not his person. Just good. And I don't know how to build the rest of my life around being someone's good enough. That weekend, Maren drove alone to visit her mother, who lived 2 hours away in the small coastal town where Maren had grown up. She had not planned the trip, had simply woken up on Saturday morning with an overwhelming need to be somewhere that felt entirely her own, somewhere untouched by the 4 years she had spent building a life with Daniel. Her mother, a sharp, observant woman who had raised Maren largely on her own after her father passed away when Maren was 12, took one look at her daughter's face when she opened the door and immediately put the kettle on without asking any questions. They sat together at the small kitchen table where Maren had done her homework as a child, and slowly, over the course of the afternoon, Maren told her everything. Her mother listened without interrupting, her expression calm and steady, the same expression she had worn through every crisis of Maren's childhood and adolescence. When Maren finally finished speaking, her mother reached across the table and took her hand. "Do you remember what I told you when you were 16, and that boy broke things off with you before prom?" her mother asked. Maren managed a small, tired smile. "You told me that anyone who doesn't choose you fully isn't worth building a life around." "That's right," her mother said. "And I still believe that, sweetheart. It doesn't matter how much time has passed, or how comfortable the life you've built together feels. If a man tells you, even in a moment of carelessness, that you weren't his first choice, you have to ask yourself whether you're willing to spend the rest of your life as someone's consolation prize, because that feeling doesn't usually go away. It just gets buried under routine and comfort, until one day you wake up and realize you've spent decades settling for less than you deserve." Maren sat with her mother's words long after she had driven back home that evening, turning them over in her mind as she pulled into the driveway and saw the lights on in the living room, Daniel's silhouette visible through the curtains as he moved around the kitchen. She sat in the car for several minutes before going inside, watching the familiar shape of the house she had once believed would hold her entire future, and felt, for the first time since the party, a strange sense of clarity beginning to settle over her confusion. She was not going to make a rushed decision. She was not going to let anger or hurt push her into something she might regret. But she understood, with growing certainty, that she needed to seriously consider what her life might look like without Daniel in it, not as a threat or a punishment, but as an honest possibility she owed herself the chance to explore. Inside, Daniel greeted her with careful warmth, asking about her mother, offering to reheat the dinner he had made for her. Maren accepted, and they ate together at the kitchen table, in a silence that was not quite comfortable, but was not quite hostile either. Two people navigating the uncertain space between an old life and whatever came next. Later that night, lying awake in the guest room, Maren pulled out her phone and, almost without deciding to, searched for a family law attorney in their area. She did not call the number that appeared. She simply saved it, a small, quiet act that felt, in that moment, like the first real step toward reclaiming a future she had once assumed would always include him. She did not know yet whether she would use the number, but knowing it was there, saved and waiting, gave her a strange, steady kind of comfort, the comfort of knowing that whatever she decided in the coming weeks, the decision would finally, truly, be her own. 3 weeks after the conversation in the kitchen, Maren called the attorney whose number she had saved. Her name was Ms. Faraday, a calm, efficient woman with a soft voice and a direct manner that Maren found immediately reassuring. They met in a small office downtown, its walls lined with law books and framed diplomas, and Maren found herself explaining her situation with a steadiness that surprised her, as though she had rehearsed the words 100 times in her mind before ever speaking them aloud. "I'm not asking you to file anything yet," Maren clarified early in the conversation. "I just want to understand my options. I want to know what things would look like if I decided to move forward with a separation." Ms. Faraday nodded, unbothered, and walked her through the basics, explaining the process in clear, practical terms that stripped away much of the emotional weight Maren had been carrying, and replaced it, at least temporarily, with something more manageable. They discussed the house, which they had purchased together 3 years into the marriage. They discussed finances, which had always been shared but not particularly complicated, since neither of them had significant debts or assets beyond the house itself. They discussed timelines, paperwork, the general shape of what a separation would require. By the time Maren left the office, she felt lighter than she had in weeks, not because she had made a final decision, but because she finally understood the shape of the path in front of her, even if she had not yet decided to walk it. She did not tell Daniel about the meeting. Their conversations at home had settled into a careful, fragile politeness, the kind two people maintain when they both sense that something significant is approaching, but neither is ready to name it directly. Daniel continued his small gestures, though they had grown less frequent, as though he too sensed that flowers and notes on the mirror were not going to be enough to close the distance that had opened between them. One evening, nearly a month after the party, Daniel finally asked the question Maren had been expecting for weeks. They were sitting together in the living room, the television playing quietly in the background, neither of them really watching it. "Are you leaving me?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost fragile in a way she rarely heard from him. Maren turned to look at him, and for a moment, she saw not the confident, easygoing man she had married, but someone smaller and more uncertain, someone genuinely afraid of losing something he valued, even if he had not always valued it in the way she deserved. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I'm still trying to figure out what I want." "I love you," Daniel said. "I know I messed up. I know what I said at that party was wrong, and I know I wasn't honest with you about how things really ended with Claire. But that was years ago, Maren. I chose you. Every single day since then, I've chosen you. Doesn't that count for something?" Maren considered his words carefully before responding. She did not doubt that he believed what he was saying. She did not doubt that, in his own way, he had built a genuine life with her, day by day, choice by choice, even if the beginning of their story had been messier and less honest than she had once believed. "It does count for something," she said finally. "But I don't think that's really the question anymore. The question isn't whether you've chosen me since then. The question is whether I can keep building a life with someone who let me believe a story that wasn't true, for 4 years, and who still, even now, hasn't fully explained why." Daniel had no answer for this, and the silence between them stretched out, heavy and unresolved, filling the space where reassurance might once have lived. Over the following 2 weeks, Maren continued meeting with Miss Faraday, gathering information, understanding her options, slowly building the framework of a decision she had not yet fully made, but could feel taking shape inside her with each passing day. She began looking, quietly, at small apartments in her price range, not with any firm intention of moving, but simply to understand what her life might look like if she chose to build it alone. She found herself drawn to a small one-bedroom apartment not far from her office, with large windows that let in generous afternoon light, and a small balcony, just large enough for a chair and a few potted plants. Standing in the empty space during a viewing, imagining her own furniture arranged against the bare walls, Maren felt something unexpected stir inside her, something that felt less like grief and more like possibility. She thought about her mother's words, about the difference between being loved and being chosen. She thought about the version of herself who had stood in that hallway at the party, frozen and silent, listening to her husband describe her as a good enough consolation. And she thought, too, about the version of herself standing in this small, sunlit apartment, imagining a life built entirely on her own terms, answerable to no one but herself. She did not sign a lease that day, but she left the viewing with the apartment's information carefully saved in her phone, alongside the attorney's number, 2 small, quiet pieces of a decision that was slowly, steadily, becoming clear. That night, she sat across from Daniel at their kitchen table one final time, and told him, calmly and without anger, that she had decided to move forward with a separation. He did not argue, not really. Perhaps some part of him had already sensed this outcome coming, had watched it approaching in the careful distance she had maintained over the past month, in the quiet efficiency with which she had begun handling their conversations. He simply nodded, his eyes glistening slightly, and said, "I understand." It was, Maren thought later, the most honest thing he had said to her in weeks. The weekend Maren moved out began with gray morning light filtering through the curtains of the bedroom she had shared with Daniel for 4 years, and it ended, 12 hours later, with her standing in the middle of her new apartment, surrounded by boxes, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and something she had not expected to feel so strongly, relief. She had chosen a weekend when Daniel was away visiting his parents, a trip they had planned together months earlier, before any of this had unfolded, back when their biggest concern had been whether to bring a gift for his mother's birthday. Rather than cancel the trip, Maren had encouraged him to go, using the time to quietly and efficiently pack her belongings with help from Priya and 2 other friends who arrived early Saturday morning with coffee, boxes, and a rented moving van. They worked steadily through the day, wrapping dishes in newspaper, disassembling furniture, carrying boxes down the front steps and into the van waiting at the curb. Maren had decided, after careful thought, to leave most of the larger furniture behind, taking only the pieces that felt distinctly her own: her grandmother's writing desk, a bookshelf she had owned since college, a set of soft blue curtains she had chosen for the guest room and had grown fond of during the weeks she'd spent sleeping there. By early afternoon, the house had begun to look strange and unfamiliar, half full and half empty, like a photograph slowly fading at the edges. Maren moved through the rooms one last time before they finished loading the van, running her fingers along the kitchen counter where she had made thousands of meals, standing for a moment in the doorway of the room that had once been Daniel's home office, remembering small, ordinary moments that now felt impossibly distant. She left a note for Daniel on the kitchen table, brief but not unkind, explaining that she had moved her things to the new apartment and that they could discuss the remaining details of the house and their finances the following week, once he had time to process everything. She did not want him to walk into an empty house without any warning, no matter how the ending of their marriage had come about. By evening, her new apartment was filled with boxes stacked haphazardly against the walls, furniture arranged in rough approximations of where it would eventually settle, and the soft blue curtains hanging crookedly in the large front windows, not yet perfectly straightened, but already transforming the space into something that felt, unmistakably, like the beginning of somewhere new. Priya stayed behind after the others left, helping Maren unpack the essentials, the two of them sitting on the bare living room floor eating takeout straight from the containers, laughing quietly at the absurdity of the day, at the strange mixture of exhaustion and freedom that seemed to fill the small apartment. "How do you feel?" Priya asked, watching her friend carefully over a container of noodles. Maren considered the question seriously before answering, looking around at the boxes surrounding them, at the unfamiliar walls that would soon become familiar, at the quiet, empty space that belonged entirely to her. "Sad," she admitted, "but also lighter than I've felt in months, maybe longer than that." "That makes sense," Priya said gently. "You're allowed to feel both things at once." Maren nodded, grateful, not for the first time, for a friend who understood grief did not always arrive in tidy, singular emotions, but often came tangled together with relief, hope, and exhaustion, all at once, refusing to be separated into neat categories. Later that night, after Priya had gone home and Maren was alone in her new apartment for the first time, she sat on the floor of her bedroom, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, and allowed herself, finally, to cry. She cried for the marriage she had believed in, for the version of Daniel she had loved so completely, for the 4 years she had spent building a life on a foundation she had not fully understood. She cried, too, for the woman she had been at the party, frozen in that hallway, listening to words that had changed everything, and for the strength it had taken to walk away from those words rather than simply absorbing them, silently, the way she might once have done. When the tears finally slowed, she wiped her face, stood, and walked to the window, looking out at the unfamiliar street below, at streetlights she did not yet recognize, at a neighborhood she was only beginning to learn. She thought about her mother's words, about the difference between being loved and being chosen, and she thought, too, about a new question that had begun forming quietly in her mind over the past several weeks. What did it mean to choose herself? She did not have a full answer yet. But, standing at the window of her new apartment, surrounded by boxes and unfamiliar shadows, she felt, for the first time in a long while, that she was finally beginning to find out. The following days settled into a new and unfamiliar rhythm. She woke each morning in a bedroom that still smelled faintly of fresh paint, made coffee in a kitchen she was still learning to navigate, and left for work along a route that no longer passed the house she had once called home. Daniel called twice that first week, his voice careful and subdued, and though Maren answered both times, their conversations remained brief and practical, focused mainly on logistics, dividing remaining possessions, deciding what to do with the house, coordinating with Ms. Faraday to formalize the details of their separation. There were moments, in those early days, when grief crept up on her unexpectedly, triggered by small things, a song on the radio that reminded her of a road trip they had taken together, the sight of a couple laughing in a restaurant window as she walked home from work, the quiet ache of an empty side of the bed she was slowly growing accustomed to. But there were other moments too, quieter and more surprising, when she found herself genuinely content, arranging her grandmother's writing desk beneath the window, choosing paint colors for the small guest room she planned to turn into a reading nook, cooking simple meals for one and finding, unexpectedly, a kind of peace in the solitude. By the end of that first week, standing in her kitchen on a quiet Sunday evening, surrounded by boxes that had finally, mostly, been emptied, Maren understood that she was not simply surviving the end of her marriage. She was beginning, slowly and deliberately, to build something new, something that belonged entirely to her, shaped by choices no one else had any part in making. Months passed, and the sharp edges of grief that had marked Maren's first weeks alone gradually softened into something quieter, more manageable, though they never entirely disappeared. She learned, during this time, that healing did not move in a straight line, that some days felt effortless and light, while others arrived heavy with unexpected sadness, triggered by nothing more significant than a familiar scent or a half-remembered anniversary. She continued working with Miss Faraday to finalize the details of the separation, a process that moved more smoothly than she had feared, largely because Daniel, to his credit, did not fight her on the practical matters. They agreed to sell the house, splitting the proceeds evenly, and divided their remaining shared belongings with a quiet, business-like efficiency that felt, in its own strange way, like a final act of respect for the years they had spent building a life together. By early autumn, nearly 6 months after the party where everything had changed, Maren's apartment had transformed from a space filled with unpacked boxes into a home entirely her own. The blue curtains hung straight and even in the front windows. Her grandmother's writing desk sat beneath them, usually covered with a scattering of books and a half-finished cup of tea. She had painted the small guest room a warm, soft yellow, filled it with a comfortable armchair and stacks of books she had been meaning to read for years, and had begun spending her Sunday afternoons there, curled up with a novel, something she had not made time for in years of married life. She reconnected, too, with parts of herself she realized she had quietly set aside during her marriage. She began attending a pottery class on Tuesday evenings, something she had mentioned wanting to try years earlier, but had never quite gotten around to, always finding some reason to postpone it in favor of whatever Daniel had planned for their evenings together. She found, in the slow, deliberate work of shaping clay on the wheel, a kind of meditative peace she had not expected, her hands covered in soft gray dust, her mind quiet and focused in a way it rarely was elsewhere. She also began running again, something she had loved in her 20s before gradually letting it fall away, replaced by other priorities. She started slowly, just short loops around her new neighborhood in the early mornings before work, but within a few months, found herself training for a half-marathon with a small group of women she had met through a local running club, women who knew nothing about her marriage or the reasons behind her divorce, who simply knew her as Maren, a woman rebuilding her life 1 mile at a time. Daniel reached out occasionally during these months, mostly through brief, careful texts, a birthday message in early summer, sent with what felt like genuine warmth, but which Maren did not respond to beyond a polite thank you. A message in late August, asking if she wanted to grab coffee sometime, to catch up as friends, which she declined gently but firmly, explaining that she needed more time and space before she could consider any kind of ongoing relationship, even a platonic one. He did not push. His messages grew less frequent as the months passed, and eventually, though neither of them formally acknowledged it, their communication settled into an occasional, distant politeness, the kind shared between two people who had once built a life together, but were now, undeniably, building separate ones. Maren thought about him less often than she had expected to, though he still surfaced in her mind at unexpected moments, usually gentle rather than painful. She would see a couple at a restaurant, laughing over a shared appetizer the way she and Daniel used to, and feel a brief, wistful pang, not quite grief, not quite anger, simply the quiet recognition of something that had once been real, and was now, permanently, part of her past. She spoke with her mother often during this period, grateful for a steady, familiar voice at the end of the phone line whenever the weight of rebuilding her life alone felt particularly heavy. Her mother, unsurprisingly, never once suggested that Maren had made the wrong choice, never once hinted that perhaps she should have stayed and worked things out. Instead, she offered quiet, consistent encouragement, reminding Maren, in her own steady way, that healing took time, that building a new life required patience, and that the woman Marin was becoming, piece by careful piece, was someone worth the effort. By the time autumn deepened into its full golden colors, Marin found herself standing at the starting line of her first half marathon, surrounded by hundreds of other runners, the early morning air crisp and cool against her skin. She had trained for months for this moment, pushing through early mornings and sore muscles, building strength and endurance she had not known she possessed. As the starting horn sounded and the crowd of runners surged forward, Marin felt something powerful settle over her, a quiet, steady confidence that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval or choice, a confidence built entirely on her own effort, her own resilience, her own decision to keep moving forward even when the path ahead had felt uncertain. She crossed the finish line 2 hours and 11 minutes later, exhausted, sweat-soaked, and genuinely proud of herself, in a way she had not felt in years. Priya was waiting near the finish line, cheering loudly, holding up a handmade sign with Marin's name written in bright, uneven letters. They embraced, both of them laughing, and Marin felt, standing there in the crisp autumn morning surrounded by cheering strangers and the steady, grounding presence of her closest friend, that she had finally, truly, begun to reclaim her own life. That evening, sitting on her small balcony with a cup of tea, watching the sun set over her new neighborhood, Marin allowed herself to reflect on everything that had happened over the past 6 months. She thought about the woman she had been at that party, frozen in the hallway, absorbing words that had shattered her understanding of her own marriage. She thought about the careful, methodical way she had gathered the truth, piece by piece, refusing to let herself be talked out of what she instinctively knew. And she thought, finally, about the quiet, steady courage it had taken to walk away from a life that looked, from the outside, entirely stable and secure, simply because she understood, with unshakable clarity, that she deserved more than being someone's good enough. She did not know exactly what the future held. She did not know if she would eventually build a new relationship, whether she would remain single for years, or find someone new who chose her, fully and without reservation, from the very beginning. But sitting on her balcony that evening, watching the last light fade from the autumn sky, she understood, with a peace she had not expected to feel so completely, that whatever came next, she would face it as herself, whole and entirely her own. Nearly a year after the party that had changed everything, Marin found herself sitting across a small cafe table from a man named Julian, a fellow member of her running club who had asked her to coffee after several months of easy, comfortable conversation during their weekend training sessions. She had hesitated before accepting his invitation, uncertain whether she was ready to open herself up to someone new, but something about Julian's easy patience, the way he never rushed her, the way he seemed genuinely interested in the small details of her life without any hidden agenda, had made her feel, for the first time in a long while, that trust might not be as impossible as it had once seemed. Their conversation that afternoon moved easily between topics, running strategies, favorite books, the small quirks of their respective jobs. At one point, Julian asked, gently and without any pressure, about her previous marriage, and Marin found herself answering honestly, without the careful guardedness she had maintained in earlier months whenever the subject arose. "I was married for 4 years," she said. "It ended because I found out some things about how it started that I couldn't move past. Things that made me realize I wasn't ever really his first choice, even though I thought I was for a long time." Julian listened carefully, his expression thoughtful rather than pitying, and when she finished, he said something that stayed with her long after their coffee had gone cold. "That sounds like it took a lot of courage to walk away from. A lot of people would have stayed just because it was comfortable, even if it wasn't right." Marin smiled, surprised by how easily his words settled into her, without the sting of pity or the awkward discomfort she had grown used to encountering whenever she discussed her divorce with new people. "I think I finally understood that comfort and being chosen aren't the same thing," she said. "It took me a while to figure that out." They continued seeing each other over the following weeks, slowly, without rushing toward anything more serious than they were both ready for. Julian never made Marin feel like a consolation prize, never gave her reason to wonder whether she was simply convenient or available at the right moment. He asked thoughtful questions about her interests, remembered small details from their conversations, made genuine effort to understand who she was, not who he wanted or needed her to be. One evening, several months into their relationship, as they sat together on Marin's small balcony, watching the city lights flicker on across the skyline. Julian turned to her with unusual seriousness. "I want you to know something," he said. "I've dated other people before you, and honestly, none of them ever felt like this. You're not a rebound for me, or a consolation, or anything close to that. You're just you, and that's exactly who I want." Maren felt something warm and unfamiliar unfold in her chest, a feeling she recognized, cautiously, as the beginning of real trust. She did not respond immediately, needing a moment to sit with the significance of his words, but when she finally spoke, her voice was steady and sure. "That means more to me than you probably realize," she said. "I spent a long time believing I was someone's good enough. I'm not interested in being anyone's good enough again." "You're not," Julian said simply. "You never should have been in the first place." Their relationship continued to grow steadily over the following months, built on a foundation of honesty and genuine choice that Maren had once believed she might never find again. She did not rush toward any major decisions, mindful of the lessons she had learned from her previous marriage, taking time to build trust, slowly, deliberately, allowing the relationship to develop at its own natural pace, rather than forcing it into any predetermined shape. During this time, Maren also continued building the other parts of her life that had nothing to do with romantic relationships at all. She had been promoted at work, taking on a larger role managing several major projects for her architecture firm, a responsibility that challenged her in new ways and reminded her, daily, of her own competence and capability. She had completed 2 more half-marathons, each one strengthening not just her body, but her confidence in her own resilience. She had grown close with several of the women from her running club, building a small but meaningful community of friends who supported and celebrated each other through both triumphs and difficulties. She had also, gradually, begun speaking with Daniel again, though their relationship had settled into something entirely different from what it had once been, a distant, careful friendship built on mutual respect rather than romantic attachment. They met occasionally for coffee, discussing work and mutual friends, and though there remained a quiet undercurrent of what had once existed between them, both understood, without needing to say it explicitly, that the door to reconciliation had permanently closed. During one of these occasional meetings, nearly a year and a half after their separation, Daniel finally offered Maren the full explanation she had once desperately wanted, but had eventually stopped needing. He told her, honestly and without excuses, that he had still been emotionally entangled with Claire when they had first met, that he had not been fully honest with himself about the overlap, let alone with Maren, and that over the years, he had convinced himself the small lie about the timeline did not matter, since their marriage had seemed, from his perspective, genuinely happy. "I know now that it did matter," he said quietly. "I understand why you left. I think, in some way, I always understood, even before you actually did it. I just didn't want to face what that meant." Maren listened to his explanation with a calm, settled peace that surprised her, feeling none of the anger or hurt that once would have accompanied such a conversation. "I appreciate you telling me the truth," she said. "I hope you found some peace with everything too." "I'm working on it," Daniel admitted. "You look happy, Maren, genuinely happy." "I'm glad." "I am happy," she said. And she meant it completely, aware, as she said the words, of just how far she had traveled from the frozen, uncertain woman who had once stood in a hallway, overhearing a conversation that would eventually change the entire shape of her life. 2 years after the party where she had overheard the words that changed her life, Maren stood on a small wooden deck overlooking the ocean, a warm breeze moving gently through her hair, surrounded by close friends and family gathered to celebrate her engagement to Julian. It was a small, intimate gathering, nothing like the large formal party where her first marriage had ended, before it truly began to unravel in her own understanding, and she found a quiet, deliberate comfort in that difference, in the simplicity and honesty of everything Julian had built with her. Her mother stood nearby, chatting warmly with Priya, occasionally glancing over at Maren with an expression of quiet, proud satisfaction. Maren caught her mother's eye at one point during the evening and smiled, remembering the conversation they had shared at the kitchen table 2 years earlier, remembering her mother's steady words about the difference between being loved and being fully chosen. Julian approached her as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, wrapping his arm gently around her waist, and together they watched the sky shift through soft shades of orange and gold. Happy? He asked quietly. Completely, Maren said, and she meant it in a way she had not fully understood the word to mean before. A happiness, built not on the absence of struggle, but on the strength she had discovered in herself, through navigating that struggle honestly and courageously. Standing there, watching the sunset, with the man who had chosen her fully, without hesitation or comparison, Maren allowed herself to reflect on the long journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the woman she had been 2 years earlier, frozen in a hallway, listening to words that had shattered her understanding of her own worth. She thought about the careful, methodical courage it had taken to seek out the truth, piece by piece, even when part of her had desperately wanted to look away. She thought about the quiet strength required to walk away from a life that appeared, from the outside, entirely stable, simply because she had understood, with unshakable clarity, that she deserved to be someone's clear and certain choice, not merely their convenient one. She thought, too, about everything she had built in the time since that painful night, the apartment that had slowly transformed from a collection of boxes into a genuine home, the pottery classes that had taught her patience and presence, the half-marathons that had proven, mile after difficult mile, the depth of her own resilience, the promotion at work that had reminded her of her professional competence and value, the friendships that had deepened and strengthened, offering steady support through every difficult and uncertain moment, and finally, the slow, careful trust she had built with Julian, a trust rooted not in desperation or convenience, but in genuine, deliberate choice. She understood now, standing on that deck with the ocean breeze moving gently around her, that the party where everything had fallen apart had not, in the end, been a tragedy, though it had certainly felt like one in those first raw, painful weeks. It had been, instead, an unexpected doorway, one that had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths she might otherwise have spent years avoiding, and that had ultimately led her toward a life far more honest and fulfilling than the one she had been living before. Later that evening, after most of the guests had left and only a small group of close friends remained, gathered around a fire pit on the beach below the deck, Priya sat beside Maren, both of them watching the flames dance against the darkening sky. "Do you ever think about that night?" Priya asked quietly. "The party, I mean, the one where you overheard everything." Maren considered the question for a long moment, watching the fire crackle and shift, feeling the warm weight of Julian's hand resting gently in hers nearby. "But not the way I used to. I used to think about it as the night everything fell apart. Now I think about it as the night I finally started paying attention to what I actually deserved." "You handled it with so much strength," Priya said. "I don't think I could have done what you did. Investigating everything so calmly, confronting him without falling apart, walking away without looking back." Maren smiled, watching the fire, feeling the steady warmth of Julian's hand in hers, the comfortable presence of close friends gathered around her, the quiet, settled peace that had taken so long to build but now felt entirely solid and secure. "I think the hardest part wasn't walking away," she said finally. "The hardest part was believing I deserved to. It took me a long time to understand that being someone's good enough wasn't something I had to accept, just because leaving felt frightening and uncertain." "And now?" Priya asked. Maren looked toward Julian, who caught her eye across the fire and smiled, a warm, genuine smile that held none of the careful calculation or convenient timing that had once shaped her understanding of love. "Now," Maren said, "I know exactly what it feels like to be someone's first and only choice, and I'm never going to settle for anything less again." The fire crackled softly against the night, the ocean waves rolled steadily against the shore in the darkness beyond, and Maren sat surrounded by the life she had built entirely through her own courage and determination, a life shaped not by what someone else had chosen for her, but by everything she had finally, fully, chosen for herself.